The wind carried the faint smell of rain that afternoon, brushing against the porch where Emily Carter sat with her hands wrapped around a half-empty cup of tea. The mug had gone cold, but she didn't notice. Her eyes were fixed on the horizon where the hills turned blue and the last of the sunlight touched the old oak trees behind their farmhouse. It had been a long time since she'd allowed herself to just sit still. The world around her had changed so quickly, her father's laughter fading into memory, her mother's voice growing quiet with the passing years, and the bookstore they once ran together now filled with dust and silence. The sign above the door, Carter's Books and Coffee, swung slightly in the breeze, its paint peeling from time and weather. For Emily, that small shop wasn't just a business, it was her entire childhood. She had learned to read in that corner chair by the window, where her father used to sit with her after school. Every night, he'd let her pick a story, and together they'd travel through distant lands and dream up worlds of their own. Her mother, Grace, would smile softly from behind the counter, pretending not to watch them while arranging books by color instead of title because, as she used to say, stories should look as beautiful as they feel. But that was years ago now. Emily was 25, and the bookstore was more quiet than alive. The shelves still stood tall, but the laughter was gone. Her father, Richard, had passed away to winters earlier, leaving behind more than just the scent of old pages. He left behind unfinished words, promises, and choices no one was ready to make. Grace had grown quieter since then. She rarely spoke of Richard anymore, and when she did, it was always about practical things, bills, repairs, orders. The warmth that once filled their home had turned into careful politeness, as though both mother and daughter were afraid to touch the fragile thread that still connected them. Emily often wondered if her father had known this would happen. Maybe that was why he'd asked her on that porch years ago to promise something she didn't fully understand at the time. The memory that never faded, she could still see it clearly. The summer evening, the smell of grass after the rain, her father's serious face as he looked at her and said, no matter what happens, take care of your mother. Promise me that." Chad laughed then, thinking he was just being sentimental. But when he didn't laugh back, her smile faded. "I promise," she'd whispered. Those two words had followed her through every decision since. Every time she thought about leaving town, every time she wanted something more than routine and duty, her promise had kept her rooted here. In the same small town where everyone knew her as Richard Carter's daughter, she didn't mind being that girl. But sometimes when the evenings grew long and the town lights blinked on one by one, she wondered what her life might look like beyond these hills. Was there more for her out there? Or was she destined to keep reliving the same quiet days, honoring a promise that now felt like both love and burden? A quiet rift at home that night. The kitchen was filled with the soft ticking of the old wall clock. Grace was washing dishes, her sleeves rolled up, her silver bracelet glinting in the light. "Mom," Emily began carefully, "I was thinking about reopening the shop again this weekend. Maybe bring back the Saturday book readings like Dad used to do." Grace paused, hands still in the sink. "Emily, honey, maybe it's time to move on. The world's changing. People read online now. But this place sits who we are," Emily said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Dad built it with you." Grace sighed, drying her hands. "Yes, and now it's just the two of us. You don't have to stay stuck here because of me." Emily looked at her mother, then the same woman who once sang while baking bread, who laughed so loudly her father would pretend to cover his ears. But now her laughter seemed buried under years of grief. Grace turned away, pretending to fix the curtain, and whispered almost too softly to hear, "You remind me too much of him." The words hung in the air like a confession neither of them wanted to face. The stranger by the window a few days later, the first customer in weeks, walked into the bookstore. The bell above the door chimed softly. Emily looked up from her notebook to see a man about her age standing in the doorway, tall, wearing a simple gray coat, holding a small stack of books in his arms. He smiled awkwardly, as if unsure whether he was welcome. "Hi," he said. "I didn't realize this place was still open." "It's open when I'm here," Emily replied with a small smile. He laughed quietly. That's fair. I'm Daniel. Emily, she said, taking the books from him. You like old poetry? Always, he replied. Something about it feels honest. For the first time in months, Emily felt a spark of warmth in the quiet store. She didn't know it yet, but Daniel's arrival would slowly unravel the secrets that had been buried in her family since the day her father made her promise. The hook that night, Emily stood on the porch again, the same place where her father once asked for her promise. The stars were faint, the wind gentle. Somewhere in the house, Grace was humming a song she hadn't sung in years. Emily closed her eyes, whispering to the dark, Dad, what did you really want me to do? The silence didn't answer, but deep down, she felt something stir, like a truth she wasn't ready to face just yet. And that's where her story truly began. The next morning, rain finally came. It wasn't heavy, just a soft, steady drizzle that blurred the edges of the town. The street outside the bookstore glistened, and water traced delicate paths down the window glass. Emily stood inside, sweeping the floor, her thoughts miles away. Every sound the creak of the floorboards. The ticking clock above the counter carried the weight of memory sometimes. When she was alone here, she could almost hear her father's voice echoing through the aisles. Stories are meant to be shared. Don't keep them locked away. That memory always made her chest tighten, the way things used to be years ago. The store had been the beating heart of the town. Children would sit cross-legged on the rug every Saturday while her father read aloud, his deep voice filling the room like music. Grace would bring out trays of cookies, laughing as she tried to keep the crumbs off the new books. Those afternoons were full of warmth and sound, the kind of simple happiness that didn't need words. Back then, Emily's biggest dream was to be just like her parents, to build something beautiful together, to love like they did. She remembered one evening, clearly a night, when the sky turned golden with the setting sun. Her father had just finished reading The Secret Garden to a group of children. As the families left, her mother placed a hand on his shoulder. You make this place feel alive, Grace said, her voice full of pride. Richard smiled, brushing a bit of dust from her cheek. No, he said softly, you do. Emily had watched them from behind the counter, their laughter mingling with the fading light. At the time, she didn't realize that moments like that don't last forever. The silence that followed when her father fell ill. The house grew quieter with every passing day. The sound of books closing replaced the laughter that once filled the evenings. Emily had been 19 then, old enough to understand, but too young to carry the weight that was coming. One night, she had gone into his room to bring him tea. He was sitting by the window, staring out into the dark, a blanket over his shoulders. You know what hurts the most, Em? He had said, without looking at her, leaving something unfinished. Not knowing if the people you love will understand what you meant. She didn't know what to say. She just sat beside him, holding his hand. Now, standing in that same store years later. Those words echoed like a quiet melody she couldn't stop hearing. A stranger who felt familiar, the doorbell chimed again. Daniel was back. He carried a notebook this time, and a hesitant smile. His brown hair was damp from the rain, and a faint trace of coffee scent followed him. Looks like I've made this place my second home, he said with a small laugh. Emily smiled. It's a good place for that. Most of the books here are older than both of us. He glanced around, his eyes lingering on the high shelves. Old stories have a way of making you feel less alone. He said, something about that line made Emily pause. They talked for a while about poetry, about the quietness of small towns, about how life often takes turns no one expects. The conversation flowed easily, like they'd known each other longer than a few days. At one point, Daniel mentioned, I used to visit a place like this with my mother. It was the only place she seemed truly happy. Emily looked at him with understanding. I know what that's like, she whispered. Their eyes met for a moment, gentle. Searching, not romantic yet, but full of quiet connection. It was the kind of look that said, I see your pain. Even if I don't know your story. The old photo album that evening. After Daniel left, Emily went up to the attic to find something for the store's reopening. Dust motes floated in the beam of her flashlight as she lifted a stack of boxes. One of them was labeled Family Photos. She sat down on the wooden floor, opening the lid slowly. Inside were hundreds of pictures, some fading, some torn at the corners. There was one of her parents dancing at the bookstore's anniversary party. Her father's arms around Grace, both of them laughing, her mother's head tilted back in joy. Emily smiled sadly. They had once been inseparable, two people who built a dream together. But after his death, Grace couldn't bear to step inside the shop. Maybe it hurt too much. She traced her fingers over the picture and whispered, "You'd know what to." The morning began with golden light spilling across the shelves of Carter's books and coffee. For the first time in years, sunlight seemed to fill every corner instead of hiding in dust and shadow. Emily opened the shop early, humming softly under her breath. Her sleeves rolled up and her hair loosely tied back. The town had started to notice the change. People peeked through the windows when passing by. A few even stopped to ask when the store would officially reopen. For the first time since her father's passing, the air felt alive again, like the story of their family was stirring from a long pause. Emily couldn't help but think of Daniel. He'd been there almost every day that week, helping without being asked. He brought coffee, rearranged shelves, and even repaired the old reading lamp that had been flickering for years. He never asked for anything in return, and though she didn't say it aloud, Emily looked forward to the sound of the doorbell that announced his arrival each morning. A sudden reminder that afternoon. While sorting through a pile of books near the counter, Emily found something unexpected. Between two thick novels was a folded note yellowed with age. Her heart skipped. She recognized her father's handwriting immediately. She unfolded it carefully. The ink was slightly faded, but the words were still clear. "If you ever reopen this store, it means you found the strength I always believed in. Don't let fear decide your life. There's more waiting for you than you think." Tears welled in her eyes. For a long moment, she couldn't move. The smell of paper and dust surrounded her, and she felt her father's presence as if he were standing right beside her. "Dad," she whispered. The sound of the doorbell pulled her back. Daniel stepped inside, shaking off the cold air. "You're here early," he said, smiling. "I couldn't sleep," she admitted, wiping at her eyes quickly. "I found something." He noticed the paper in her hand and stepped closer. "Is that from your father?" Emily nodded. "I think he left it for me to find. Maybe when I was ready." Daniel didn't speak right away. He simply stood beside her, letting the moment breathe. Then, quietly, he said, "Sometimes the things we're meant to find don't appear until we've healed enough to understand them." She looked up at him, her heart tightening not from sorrow, but from the way his words gently echoed what her father might have said. "Thank you," she whispered. He smiled faintly. "You don't have to thank me for being here." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The air between them was warm, full of unspoken understanding. It wasn't romance, not yet, but a connection deeper than comfort. A memory rekindled later that day. As they organized a corner of the store, Emily found an old photo album she hadn't seen before. Daniel helped her carry it to the counter. The leather cover cracked slightly as she opened it, releasing the faint scent of old paper. Inside were photos of her childhood birthdays, summer picnics, and the store's opening day. Her father's proud grin, her mother's gentle smile. Daniel leaned over slightly, studying one picture where little Emily was sitting on her father's shoulders, both laughing. "He adored you," Daniel said softly. "He did," she replied. "He believed I'd do something meaningful someday. I just didn't think it would be this." Daniel smiled. "Sometimes the meaning isn't in what we build, it's in what we bring back to life." His words struck something inside her again. She had spent so long trying to keep her promise to her father that she hadn't noticed she was living it already. A twist of fate that evening. They were closing the store. The town's mayor stopped by. He was an older man who had known Emily's father for decades. "Emily Carter," he said, smiling warmly. It's good to see this place open again. Your father would be proud." "Thank you," she said. Touched. The mayor looked at Daniel. "And you must be Daniel Blake. I've heard your name before. You're the writer who moved here last year, aren't you?" Daniel hesitated, surprised. "You've heard of me?" "Oh, yes," the mayor said with a chuckle. "Richard Carter talked about you once. Said he met a young man at a book fair who reminded him of his daughter, full of heart, but unsure of where to start." Emily's eyes widened. "Wait, what?" Daniel blinked. "That can't be right. I met a Richard Carter years ago in Toronto. He gave a talk about running a family bookstore. He told me stories about his daughter who loved books more than sleep." They looked at each other in disbelief. Emily whispered, "That was my dad." For a moment, the world seemed to stop. The rain outside tapped softly on the window, and a quiet awe filled the room. Her father had met Daniel years before Daniel ever came to this town, the realization after the mayor left. Emily and Daniel sat in silence, both processing what they'd just learned. "My father, he mentioned you?" she asked gently. Daniel nodded slowly. "I remember him clearly. He said something that stayed with me. When you meet someone who reminds you of home, don't ignore it. That kind of connection doesn't happen often." Emily's throat tightened. "He said that?" Daniel smiled sadly. "He did. I didn't understand it then. But now?" His voice trailed off. The air between them was heavy with emotion, grief, wonder, and something unspoken. Not attraction, but destiny. Maybe this wasn't just coincidence. Maybe, somehow. Her father had seen something neither of them yet understood. A quiet ending to a long day when Daniel left that evening. The air outside had turned crisp. Emily stood by the doorway, watching as he disappeared down the street under the glow of the street lamps. She closed the shop, turned off the lights, and stood in the quiet darkness of the bookstore. The letter lay open on the counter beside the photo of her parents. The two items seemed to speak the same message. Don't let fear decide your life. Emily smiled softly, a single tear tracing down her cheek. For the first time, she didn't feel lost. She felt guided, and though she couldn't explain how or why, she sensed that her father's wish, the one that had once confused and divided her family, was finally beginning to unfold in ways she could never have predicted. The days that followed moved gently, like pages turning in a book no one wanted to finish. The bookstore had become alive again, though not with the same energy it once had. Instead, it breathed softly, quiet laughter, faint music from the old radio, and the low hum of conversation. Emily and Daniel worked side by side, often without speaking. They didn't need to. The silence between them had changed. It wasn't empty anymore. It was full of understanding, full of something neither dared to name. Sometimes, Emily caught herself watching him as he worked, the way he tilted his head when he read, or how his smile lingered a second longer when he said goodbye. She would look away quickly, as if afraid that if she met his eyes too long, he might see something she wasn't ready to admit. It wasn't love, not yet. It was something gentler, deeper, growing quietly in the spaces where grief had once lived. The letter revisited one rainy afternoon. Emily returned to her father's letter. She'd read it so many times that she nearly knew the words by heart. But that day they felt different. Don't let fear decide your life. Her father's handwriting, steady and sure, seemed to speak directly to her heart. She thought about how fear had shaped everything since his passing. Fear of disappointing her mother, of losing what little family she had left, of letting herself feel something new after so much lost. As she traced her finger over the signature, she whispered, "I'm trying. Dad, I really am." That was when she heard the doorbell. Daniel's quiet confession. Daniel stepped in, carrying a small box. His coat was damp and his hair was slightly tousled from the wind. "I brought something for you," he said softly. He set the box on the counter and opened it to reveal a stack of freshly printed flyers, the kind you'd pin to notice boards or hand out around town. Across the top, in neat lettering, it read, "Carter's Books and Coffee, Reopening Celebration. Stories that bring us home." Emily smiled, touched. You made these. He nodded. I thought the town should know the heart of this place again. Your father would have wanted that. Her throat tightened. You didn't have to do that. Daniel gave a quiet laugh. I know, but I wanted to. For a moment, neither of them said anything. The soft patter of rain against the window filled the silence between them. Then Daniel spoke again, this time more carefully. You know, when I first came here, I thought I was running away from my own story. But now I think I've found the ending I was looking for in this shop and in the people in it. Emily felt her breath catch. She didn't know how to answer that. The warmth in his voice felt like sunlight after a long winter. All she could say was, I'm glad you came. And she meant it more deeply than she could explain, the mother's distance that evening. Grace came by the store for the first time in weeks. She stood at the doorway, hesitant, her hand resting on the frame as if unsure she was ready to walk in. Emily looked up from behind the counter. Mom, Grace smiled faintly. I saw the lights. I thought I'd stop by. Her voice was calm, but her eyes held something heavy, a mix of pride, sadness, and perhaps guilt. Daniel, sensing the weight of the moment, quietly excused himself. I'll check the storeroom, he said, giving Emily a reassuring glance before stepping away. Grace walked slowly through the aisles, her fingers brushing the spines of books she hadn't touched in years. You've done something wonderful here, she said. It feels like him again. Emily swallowed the lump in her throat. I found one of Dad's letters, she said softly. He told me not to let fear decide my life. Grace closed her eyes briefly. The morning sun filtered through the bookstore's windows, painting the wooden shelves in warm shades of gold. Dust motes drifted lazily in the light, and the faint aroma of coffee filled the air. Emily stood by the counter, reading through the last pages of her father's journal, the one she hadn't dared to finish before. Each word felt like a whisper from the past, pulling her closer to something she both longed for and feared. If you're reading this, the final entry began, then I'm proud of you. I know you faced the world with courage. But there's one more truth you need to understand. One I couldn't say aloud. Her hands trembled slightly. She turned the page, but before she could read further, Daniel entered the shop, carrying 2 cups of coffee. Morning, he greeted gently, placing one in front of her. You've been up early again? Emily smiled faintly. I couldn't sleep. I keep feeling like there's something I'm missing, something Dad wanted me to see. Daniel's gaze softened. Maybe it's not in the words. Maybe it's in what he wanted you to feel. She looked at him thoughtfully. What do you mean? He hesitated, choosing his words carefully. Sometimes the truth isn't about instructions or advice. It's about letting go of the fear that's been holding you still. Emily stared at the coffee, watching the steam curl upward. Letting go? She murmured. That's always been the hardest part. An unexpected visitor just then. The bell above the door chimed. Grace, Emily's mother, stepped in. Her presence filled the quiet room with something heavy yet familiar. Mom. Emily said softly, surprised. Grace gave a faint smile. I thought I'd help today. You've been working so hard. Emily blinked in disbelief. You want to help with the reopening? Her mother nodded. It's what your father wanted, isn't it? For this place to live again? For a moment, Emily couldn't find her voice. It was the first time her mother had spoken about the shop without bitterness or grief. Daniel quietly excused himself to the storeroom. Giving them space, Grace walked slowly around the counter, her fingers tracing the edge of an old photograph, one of her and her husband, smiling in front of the same counter years ago. I didn't come here for the store, Grace finally said. I came because I realized I was wrong. Emily looked up sharply. Wrong about what? Grace took a deep breath. About keeping you away from this place. About trying to protect you by shutting the past out. I thought forgetting him would stop the pain, but all it did was make the silence louder. Tears welled in Emily's eyes. Mom, Grace reached out, her voice trembling. Your father believed in hope, even when things fell apart. I lost sight of that. And I know he wanted you to carry it forward. Emily stepped closer, The words she'd held back for years finally breaking free. I wasn't trying to replace him, Mom. I just wanted to keep his memory alive. I wanted us to heal together. Grace's expression softened. I see that now. They stood in silence for a moment, two hearts finding common ground after years of distance. The air felt lighter, warmer, as if the room itself exhaled in relief. Daniel's truth later that afternoon. When Grace left to prepare for the reopening event, Daniel returned. He noticed the calm in Emily's expression, a kind of peace he hadn't seen before. She finally understands, Emily said quietly. For the first time, I think we're both ready to move on. Daniel smiled, his eyes gentle. That's what your father would have wanted. Emily nodded, holding the journal in her hands. There's still one page left. I haven't finished it yet. Daniel looked at her with quiet encouragement. Then maybe it's time. She opened the book. Her father's final words seemed to glow under the afternoon light. If life ever leads you to someone who reminds you of home, someone who listens, someone who stays, don't run from it. That's not coincidence. That's grace. Emily's breath caught. She looked up at Daniel, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. He shifted slightly, his voice low but steady. Your father had a way of knowing things before anyone else did, didn't he? She smiled faintly, though her eyes shimmered. He always did. Daniel hesitated, then said quietly, Emily, there's something I haven't told you. I came back to this town because of your father. Years ago, he helped me when I had nowhere to go. He told me that one day I'd understand what it meant to belong somewhere. I think this was what he meant. Emily's heart swelled with emotion. You knew him. Daniel nodded. Only briefly. But he left a mark on me the same way he left one on you. The realization hit her like a wave. Her father had not only left her a letter, he'd left her someone who understood the same lessons. The same hope. Tears filled her eyes, but they weren't from sadness this time. They were from understanding. The moment of truth, outside. The sun began to set, spilling soft orange light through the windows. Emily closed the journal and took a deep breath. All this time, I thought I was holding on to the past. But maybe the past was leading me here. Daniel nodded. Maybe it was never about rebuilding what was lost. Maybe it was about finding something new built from the same love that started it all. Their eyes met, and for the first time, neither looked away. There were no grand gestures, no declarations, just two people standing in the quiet. Both realizing that some truths don't need to be shouted to be real. Emily smiled through the last of her tears. You're right, she whispered. I think my father would have liked you. Daniel smiled back. I think he already did. The silence that followed wasn't heavy anymore. It was peaceful, the kind of silence that comes after forgiveness, after truth. After hearts finally stopped running, that night, as Emily turned off the bookstore lights, she paused at the door. For the first time since her father's passing, she didn't feel lost. She felt guided, not by words or letters, but by love that had quietly shaped her every step. She whispered into the stillness, Thank you, Dad, for everything. And as she locked the door, Daniel's reflection appeared in the glass beside hers, not as a stranger, but as someone who had become part of the story her father began. The day of the reopening arrived with the scent of early spring drifting through the air. The once quiet bookstore, Carter's Books and Coffee, stood bright again, its windows polished, its shelves filled with carefully chosen books, and a vase of fresh lilies resting on the counter. Emily stood at the front door, holding the key her father had once carried everywhere he went. She took a deep breath, feeling her heart flutter, not with nerves, but with something deeper. Peace. Grace stood beside her, smiling softly. He'd be proud, Emily, she whispered. Emily nodded, eyes glistening. I think he's here with us. Somehow. As she turned the key and the door swung open, sunlight poured in, touching the old wooden floor like a blessing. The faint chime of the bell sounded just as it always had. And for a fleeting second, Emily could almost hear her father's voice, gentle, full of warmth, saying, Welcome home, sweetheart. A town remembers the people of Maplewood trickled in one by one. Neighbors, old friends, even strangers who had once passed by the shop but never stepped inside. They smiled as they browsed, sharing stories of how the store had been part of their childhoods. A young boy tugged at his mother's sleeve near the poetry shelf. "Mom, can we get this one?" he asked, holding up a worn copy of The Secret Garden. Emily knelt beside him with a kind smile. "That's one of my favorites," she said softly. "It's about finding beauty even when things seem forgotten." The boy nodded earnestly, and his mother smiled in gratitude. Watching them, Emily's chest filled with quiet joy. This was what her father had built. Not just a store, but a place where hearts found comfort in stories. Across the room, Grace was laughing with an old friend, her laughter free and unguarded. The kind of laughter Emily hadn't heard in years. And near the counter stood Daniel, quietly organizing a new display. When he looked up and caught Emily's eyes, there was that familiar understanding between them again. The silent connection that had grown naturally. Carefully, like something meant to last, the promise fulfilled later that evening. After the last customer left and the lights grew softer, Emily locked the door and leaned against the counter. Grace was counting the day's earnings. Humming a tune under her breath, Daniel approached with 2 cups of coffee, a quiet tradition that had formed between them. "To a beautiful reopening," he said gently, raising his cup. Emily smiled. "To new beginnings." They stood in comfortable silence for a while, watching Grace arrange books with the same gentle care she once had when Richard was alive. "She looks happy," Daniel said quietly. "She does," Emily replied. "I think we both finally let him rest." Daniel nodded thoughtfully. "And maybe he's been resting all along, waiting for you to see that you weren't meant to carry the past alone." Emily looked at him, eyes soft. "You always seem to know what to say," he chuckled lightly. "Maybe I've read too many of your books." For the first time, Emily laughed, a genuine, easy laugh that filled the room. It was the sound of healing, spite of something once broken, now whole again. A letter in the attic a week later. As Emily was cleaning the attic above the shop, she found an old wooden box tucked behind a beam. Inside were faded photographs, a watch, and an envelope marked with her name. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened it. The letter was in her father's handwriting, steady, deliberate, unmistakable. "My dear Emily, if you're reading this, it means you've found your way back to where you belong. Life is not about Holden.